Welcome back to Evergreen Perspective. I'm your host today, Ben Chrisley. In part one last week, we talked about wages. We talked about how they've been frozen while everything else is getting more expensive. We've talked about how corporations and lobbyists have rewritten the rules and how people doing the work are just being left behind. And it doesn't just stop at your paycheck. That's not what you do isn't just the end of your paycheck, because even if you're working full time, if you're juggling two jobs, the cost of everything just keeps rising, but your paycheck doesn't. So in part two, we're digging into what that paycheck is actually supposed to be able to buy when you're out there working hard, right? It's supposed to provide food and shelter and medicine, the essentials you need to live everyday life. We're going to talk about how those things have become tools for profit and how they've been turned into assets for investors, while the working people, hardworking Americans, are priced out of basic survival. So let's get into it. But before we do, let's go ahead and bring in Kate for Kate's Civic Corner.
Thanks, Ben. Hey, folks. Kate here with the Civic Corner, taking a minute to highlight some opportunities to get involved here in Southwest Washington. If you don't live around here, get on the web and do a little searching. I'm sure you'll find some options near you. We'll put a link in the show notes for each of the events we're highlighting here, where you can find more information, including what to expect and how to sign up. All the details will be there. Okay, coming up on May 28th at 6:30 p.m., the Clark County Democratic Women will be holding their general meeting via Zoom. If you check out that link, the Zoom link is there. Also, on May 28th is the La Center City Council meeting. That's at 6:30 p.m. at the La Center City Hall. And on June 5th, the 18th Legislative District Republicans will hold their caucus meeting at the Clark County Republican headquarters in Vancouver. That will begin at 5:30 p.m. Now, for my favorite part, the volunteer opportunity. This week, we're highlighting the Battleground Adventist Community Services. There you can help with the food and clothing pantries, receiving, sorting, and organizing donations. You can also help by quilting. You don't need any prior sewing experience. The quilts that are made are donated to clients and sold to raise money for more materials. Again, you don't need any sewing experience. They're going to teach you how to quilt. It's pretty cool. These are just a few ways to get involved. If there's an organization or service that interests you, I'm sure with a little research, you can find a way to help out. And as always, if there's an event in Southwest Washington that you'd like us to feature here on Evergreen Perspective, please put it in the comments or send us an email. This is Kate with Kate's Civic Corner, encouraging you to get out and get involved. Back to you, Ben.
Thanks, Kate. All right, let's talk about eggs for a minute. Yeah, eggs. Because during the height of inflation in 2022 and 2023, egg prices became this symbol of everything that felt broken. And it was carried right into the presidential campaign, right? All we heard about, eggs, 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 over and over again. In just 1 year, the average price of a dozen eggs more than doubled, jumping from just under $2 a dozen to over $5 a dozen. And we were told it was because of the avian flu, that supply was down, that it was out of everyone's control. There's nothing anybody could do about it. But here's what actually happened. Yes, there was an outbreak. Yes, millions of hens were culled, but overall egg production dropped by less than 7%, and yet prices shot up over 150%. Meanwhile, families were rationing their grocery budgets, right? Having to skip buying eggs altogether. One company, Cal-Maine, the largest egg producer in the country, was making a killing during this time. They reported nearly $178 million profit. We're talking about profit in just 9 months. That's more than 5 times what they made the year before that. And get this, they didn't report one single case of bird flu in their flock. Not one. They just raised prices right along with, the other egg producers that had major issues with their flocks. So it wasn't a supply and demand thing. It was opportunism. It's greedflation, right? It's using a crisis to jack up prices and pad profits while blaming the market. And the kicker, now that supply chains have stabilized and egg supplies are almost back to normal, guess what? we know the prices haven't come back down because they never planned to lower them once they raised them. They just used that moment to reset the baseline, and hardworking Americans are the ones left paying the price. This is what corporate price gouging looks like. And it's happening across all industries, not just egg, fuel, medicine, housing, basic survival things. It's not just inflation for this business model they're using. This is what exploiting labor and consumers looks like. So it's not just about low wages or high prices in isolation. It's about a system where corporations capitalize on crisis, keeping prices elevated to maximize their profit, while the average American struggles just to afford basic necessities. You feel it. I know I do. While these companies report record earnings, many of their employees still don't earn a living wage, right? Often having to rely on public assistance programs to make ends meet. So, the next time you're at the grocery store facing sticker shock, just remember it's not inflation. It's a deliberate choice by corporations to prioritize profits over people. And they're not the only ones doing it. Big Grocery's not the only one. Energy giants, right? Many landlords, they all got in on greedflation, right? They're not the ones struggling. They're thriving, right? While hard working class families are being asked to cut back and skip doctor's visits, start GoFundMes to cover their rent, right? Just to get by, just to keep a roof over their head. I want to take a step back for a second and just say something that needs to be said out loud. Basic human needs should not be publicly traded. Food, shelter, healthcare, these aren't luxury items. They're not investment vehicles. They're necessities that all humans need, and people can't live without them. And yet in this country, we've turned them into commodities. We've handed them over to the stock market. Every time that happens, every time a grocery chain or a housing development company or a healthcare provider goes public, right? It stops being about people and starts being about profit. And we just can't have that, right? Look at the grocery industry. A few massive companies control nearly everything. From what's on the shelves, how much it costs. They set the prices. They control the supply. And they answer to one entity, and that's their shareholders. They don't care about you and me. So when prices go up, when eggs double or rent spikes or insulin costs more than a car payment, it's not just the market. It's a business decision. And the ones paying the price are the hardworking people, not those shareholders and hedge funds, right? If you're wealthy, a spike in food, might be slightly annoying. If you're working class, it can be devastating because food, rent, gas, and medicine eat up a much larger share of the income. When those prices go up to boost corporate profits, we're the ones getting squeezed, not them. Hard worker Americans are getting squeezed. We've accepted it like it's normal, like it makes sense that a company can post billions in profits while its own workers qualify for food stamps. Like it's okay that people are rationing medication or living in tents or working 2 jobs and still falling further behind, just so the shareholders can see a bump in their quarterly earning reports. It's wrong, guys. It's wrong. It's not capitalism. It's extraction. It's exploitation dressed up as some make-believe efficiency, and it's killing people. It's killing humans. We got to draw a line somewhere. There are things in this world that should not be run for profit. They should not be. Feeding people, housing people, healing people. Those aren't opportunities for shareholders. They're responsibilities of a functioning society, right? We've forgotten that. So no, I don't think grocery chains should be allowed to squeeze families just to inflate stock prices. I don't think housing should be treated like a hedge fund and traded on the stock market. And I sure as hell don't think a child's access to medical care should depend on how much somebody makes or who somebody's investment portfolio. It's time we all say enough is enough, right? Because survival should never be a business model. And we shouldn't have to choose between a roof, a meal, and a prescription just to keep Wall Street happy. And that's exactly what's happening. Let's chat about Tina for a minute. Tina's a single mom. She's seen her grocery bill go up 40%. Her rent jumped up $300. She's not living beyond her means, right? She's just trying to meet the basic needs of survival. But guess what didn't go up for her? If you guessed her paycheck, you're 1,000% right, right? And what's worse is that it's starting to feel normal. This struggle, this uncertainty. We've been told just to accept it, right? As if scraping by is some kind of moral virtue. Bullcrap, it's not, right? It's a policy failure. It's a moral failure not to take care of our citizens. Because even when the basics, food, housing, medicine, are out of reach, we're not just talking about economics anymore. We're talking about the basic survival of the human race. And if that is what normal looks like, then it's time to start asking who benefits from keeping it this way. While you're worried about some make-believe budget and overspending, people are starving and are homeless because of the policy decisions. You call yourself a fiscal responsible, but you're really not, right? It's deliberate decisions. And if you want to change the outcome, we have to look at who's writing the rules, right? Let's start with the wages, right? For decades, productivity rose, however you want to say it, and so did wages for a bit. But around 1970, that relationship was broken. The economy kept growing, but workers stopped getting their share. Why? Because policy shifted, right? Corporations pushed and paid for deregulation, right? They deliberately have continued to pass policy to weaken unions, right? They've frozen the minimum wage, right? Left behind, right? Well, everything else got more expensive. And the power that used to belong to the workers has now shifted upwards, right? We've had legislation was introduced to try to rebalance it. One major example was the PRO Act, right? The Protecting the Right to Organize Act. All right, what would this bill have done? It would have made it easier for workers to form unions, to hold employers accountable, right? Hold them accountable for when they're trying to union bust, and protect workers in gig jobs who are currently classified as independent contractors with basically no rights at all, right? And that's like half our workforce these days, it seems, right? It passed in the House, but it stalled in the Senate. It was blocked by Republican opposition and a handful of Democrats who take large checks from corporate PACs. Let's take a glance at housing next. We already know rents are through the roof. We know that corporate landlords are buying up inventory and jacking up prices. But we've had proposals on the table to help with that as well. Under the Build Back Better Act, there was a plan to invest $50 billion in affordable housing. That included building new units, preserving existing ones, and helping low-income renters stay in their current homes. But when the bill was slashed down to its passable size, right, that housing investment that was there, it was among the first things cut, right? We know we don't have enough housing in America. And it's not because we can't afford it. It's because corporate lobbyists and conservative lawmakers made sure that we wouldn't prioritize affordable housing for Americans. Even childcare was on the table. Universal pre-K, expanded child tax credits, subsidies for working families, all of it aimed at reducing the cost of raising a family and lifting millions of children out of poverty, was crushed, right? Was crushed by the Republican Senate. Then there's the issue of health care. What a broken mess health care is. And we've had proposals like Medicare for all, or even a public option that would allow people to buy into government-run insurance. I mean, it's one of the most efficient insurance out there. These plans would have reduced cost big time and expanded access, right? And it would have also removed the burden of employer-based insurance. But year after year, these proposals are shot down because pharmaceutical companies and private insurance firms spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying and buying the politicians, especially the Republicans, to vote against it because they don't want Americans to have affordable health insurance. So they can continue to take billions from the American people. Even the modest reforms like the Inflation Reduction Act right? Like letting Medicare negotiate the cost of certain prescriptions were watered down and delayed after industry pressure. Those same politicians bought out by pharmaceutical companies shot down the ability to decrease everyday dollars for the hardworking Americans, right? So, yes, we've written bills. We've just failed to pass them. Or we've allowed them to be so watered down that they don't really do anything anymore. And why? Because the system we live under responds to money more than it responds to taking care of people. Continually pitting profit over people. And until that changes, until the influence of big donors and corporate lobbyists are reined in, we're going to keep having the same conversations. We're going to keep expanding the wealth gap. Wages aren't going to rise. Rent won't stabilize. The housing market won't grow. Groceries are going to stay expensive. While we keep asking each other, why does it feel like we're falling behind? It's not a mystery. It is not a mystery. It's the result of a system that has been captured and written by and for the ultra-wealthy and the billionaires. That's exactly what's been happening. But here's the thing. If people made these rules, then people can change them. Right? Let's bring it a little closer to home for a minute. Right here in Washington State, where I'm at. Because while gridlock in D.C. grabs headlines, our state has actually been making some progress. And not just along party lines. Right? We've seen some real bipartisan support for policies that try to tackle the housing crisis, right? And giving working people a better shot at stability. One example is the Washington State Housing Trust Fund, right? 2025, this year, lawmakers came together to approve the capital budget that puts $600 million over the next 2 years towards affordable housing. That's huge, right? We need more housing. That money helps build and preserve homes for low-income families, veterans, seniors, and folks with disabilities. And it passed with support from both sides because housing shouldn't be a partisan issue, right? We got to work together to provide more housing across both sides of the aisle, right? We got to get people in homes. We need to build more homes, right? This is a testament of what lawmakers can do when they prioritize the needs of the constituents over partisan differences. And we should always strive to put people over profits. I know I do. Then there's House Bill 1110, the Middle Housing Bill. It passed back in 23. This law made it legal to build duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes in most residential neighborhoods because we've got a lot of places to build, right? We just don't have enough options, right? Now, I wish I could say that was all smooth sailing, but the truth is some of the pushback to this kind of housing reform is real, and this one's not coming from big developers or lobbyists, right? The pushback on this type of legislation is coming from neighborhoods, right? From homeowners association, right? It comes from local city councils, right? And it has a lot to do with what we call NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard mentality. Because, people say they support affordable housing, just not there. Just not on their street. Not near their kids' schools, right? So, not in my backyard. That's that mentality, right? Not in my quiet cul-de-sac. They're saying it's about parking or traffic or protecting neighborhood character. And sure, those are legitimate conversations to have. But let's be honest. What this often comes down to is that fear of change, right? Fear of change of who that might bring to their neighborhood. Because whether people say it out loud or not, there's often an underlying fear that denser housing means lower income neighbors, more renters, or communities that don't look like, the ones that have always been there, right? And that can be uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but we have to talk about it. Because NIMBY policies have helped create the very housing crisis we're trying to fix, right? Zoning laws that only allow one home per lot, that's exclusionary by design. It simply limits supply. right? It drives up prices and makes it nearly impossible for working class families to live near their jobs and their schools and in neighborhoods that they grew up in. So when state bill passed, right, legalizing middle housing like duplexes and triplexes, it wasn't just a zoning change, right? It was a value shift, a move toward inclusion instead of exclusion, right? Towards flexibility, towards solving the crisis, not just trying to manage it. But policy is only one piece. Culture has a lot to do with it too. It's got to change, right? We can't say we care about affordability, then fight every attempt to build affordable homes. We can't talk about economic justice while defending rules that keep people locked out. Because if we really want to fix this, if we want to make housing more affordable, more available, more equitable, we've got to confront that NIMBY mindset. And it can't be with shouting, right? It's got to be with some clarity, with some facts, right? And it's got to be with the reminder that everyone deserves a place to live. Everybody. We've also seen leaderships from Washington's own delegation at the federal level. Senator Cantwell, co-sponsored the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. It's been around a little while. This is an expansion of it. It's a bipartisan bill that strengthens tax credits for affordable housing projects, right? We found, and it continues to be, one of the most effective tools we have to incentivize building homes that regular, hardworking Americans can actually afford. So let's talk a little bit about this bill because it's really key, right? The Affordable Care Housing Credit Improvement Act, it works because it isn't about writing a check to people. It's a tax credit program. And here's what the basic premise of that means, right? The government offers tax incentives to developers, housing nonprofits, or local housing authorities. Anyone who's willing to build or preserve rental housing for low and moderate income people. And so that's the important piece. So instead of building luxury condos, these groups agree to build affordable apartments. In exchange for that, they get a tax break that helps cover those construction costs. Right? It's a great deal. It's a deal that says, hey, we'll help you build it if you promise to keep it affordable. Right? Those developers can then sell those tax credits to investors, which gives them the cash they need to get these projects off the ground and being built. And in return, they're required to keep the rent affordable, right? Oftentimes for 15 to 30 years. So, and this has worked well. The low-income housing tax credit program has been around, like I said, for decades. It's the single largest source of affordable housing development in the U.S. And this expanded bill is going to increase the funding and broaden access to it. It's going to make it easier to use in rural areas or in tribal communities as well. So it's good stuff, man. Who does it benefit, right? It benefits families, seniors, veterans, people who just need a stable place to live. All right? That's what we need, more affordable housing. Now, all that sounds great, but it's also worth being honest about where the risks are with a program like this. Because anytime there's money on the table, there's the possibility of fraud, loopholes and cronyism. Sometimes developers overstate the cost to, pocket the difference. Sometimes politically connected firms get first in line dibs on the funding. And sometimes projects get built in ways that technically meet the requirements, but don't truly serve people who need them most, right? There's also the issue of concentrated poverty, when all these affordable units all get pushed in kind of the same area without real investment in their infrastructure, the schools, and transportation around that, right? So that can reinforce segregation instead of solving it, and that's not a place we want to go. So yes, it's a powerful tool, but it's only as good as the oversight, the accountability, and the will to do it right. And so that's why any expansion of this program obviously has to come with real transparency, very good oversight. We want to make sure that it's actually benefiting those who are going to need it. Because if we're going to invest billions in affordable housing, we have to make sure it's not just affordable on paper. We have to make sure that it's really livable and equitable in practice. And I want to highlight one more, something that goes beyond economics and gets to justice. Let's talk about something Washington State did that's both bold and likely long overdue. We're going to talk about the Covenant Homeownership Act, right? This law was passed back in 2023, and it's one of the most direct attempts in recent memory to repair damage caused by generations of racist housing policies. I'm talking about racially restrictive covenants, literal clauses written into property deeds that said Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latino families couldn't buy homes in certain neighborhoods. And this wasn't some suggestion. This wasn't a suggestion. It was the law in many places, and it was enforced by governments, banks, realtors, and neighbors who lived in these neighborhoods. So when people say the system was rigged, this is what they mean by that, right? Entire generations were locked out of homeownership, which we know for most Americans is the number one way to build and pass down wealth. So Washington passed this act to begin doing something about that. In July of 2024, the state launched the Covenant Homeownership Program, right? And it's already making a huge impact. It offers zero interest loans to help with down payments and closing costs for first-time home buyers, right? From communities that were historically excluded. So it helped these folks get into areas that once said, hey, you can't be here. You don't belong. And here's the key. This isn't coming from general taxes. The money is funded by a $100 fee on real estate transaction, meaning the very housing market that benefited from decades of discrimination is now helping, pay to correct it. Since launching the program, it's helped 247 families buy homes across Washington. Now, some people have asked, isn't that unfair? Doesn't this exclude struggling white families? I get that. I mean, it's totally understandable to ask those questions. And the answer is no. This isn't about reverse discrimination. The program is based on history, not race alone. It's open to people who can show a connection to Washington before 1968, the year these racially restrictive covenants were still active. So yes, that can include white families too, especially those who were harmed by the same discriminatory systems or were shut out of housing in other ways during this time period. So, let's be clear. This program doesn't take anything away from anyone, and it's not a handout, right? It's a repair. It's a targeted effort to address the very real, very measurable economic damage done to specific communities by design for decades. Because we know the truth is, right? When your parents or your grandparents, if they were denied the chance to buy a home or were forced into overpriced, under-resourced neighborhoods, that affects where the next generation is and the one after that, right? That affects whether you had a stable place to live, what kind of schools you were able to attend, and whether anyone in your family had equity to pass down to the next generation. And when people say we should just move on or stop living in the past, I'd argue this isn't about the past. It's about right now. It's about whether we're willing to fix something that's still broken or whether we're going to pretend that fairness somehow just happens on its own. Right? Programs like, the Covenant Homeownership Act, they don't divide us, right? They heal divides that already exist. They give more people a fair shot at stability and equity and a future that doesn't depend on what their zip code was back in 1968. It's about progress, and Washington is leading the way, and, I'm proud of that effort. And if we can do it here, there's no reason why we can't push for similar programs across the nation, right? We can't lift everybody up. Right? And just in case you're wondering whether this kind of discrimination really happened here in Washington, I want to be very, very clear. It absolutely did. Let's take Seattle, for example. Okay? In the 1930s and 40s, federal agencies literally drew red lines on a map circling off entire neighborhoods, and they labeled them hazardous for investment. So what determined that label? What determined the label that said hazardous, right? The presence of black families, Asian immigrants, or Jewish communities. That's what made these areas hazardous for investment. These neighborhoods were cut off from loans, insurance, any infrastructure investments to improve the neighborhoods. So if you lived inside those red areas, I mean, even if you had a good job, even if you were a veteran, you were denied access to the same opportunities your white neighbors got just a few blocks away. Right? It wasn't accidental. It was mapped out that way. It was policy written into law. And speaking of veterans, let's talk about the GI Bill for a minute. Right? We mentioned veterans being shut out. Which veterans were being shut out? Because, GI Bill is often held as the most successful program in American history. In a lot of ways, it was, right? After World War II, it helped millions of returning service people go to college, buy homes, build that strong foundation for a middle-class life. But here's the part that we often don't talk about. Black veterans were largely just completely shut out. While the GI Bill didn't specifically discriminate on paper against black veterans, but, banks still denied them loans because they were black. Colleges turned them away so they couldn't get an education paid for by the GI Bill. And in places like the South, and yes, here in the Pacific Northwest, local officials simply refused to process their applications at all. So while white veterans were buying homes in booming new suburbs with, those low-interest VA loans, right? The black veterans were renting in segregated neighborhoods, often paying a lot more money for a lot less, and never getting a chance to build equity. And this isn't ancient history. That's someone's father, someone's grandfather. This isn't that long ago. And it's part of why programs like the Covenant Homeownership Act matter. It's why they matter to us. Right? They're not just about fairness moving forward. They're about repairing the harm that was baked into the system generations ago. Now, I know some people might be thinking, why should we do something about this now? Right? I didn't write those covenants. I didn't draw any lines on any maps. That wasn't my generation. So why should I be paying for it? Well, I get that. It can feel unfair to be held accountable for something you didn't personally do, right? But, here's the thing. This isn't about trying to, create some type of guilt. It's about a responsibility, not for the past, but for right now in the present. Because whether or not we caused the damage, we're living in the world it created, right? We're standing on those blocks. We didn't build the system, but we inherited it. And every day that we choose not to fix it, that's like us upholding it, right? Let's think about it like this. If you bought a house, later found out the foundation was cracked, maybe the previous owners ignored it. Maybe the builders cut corners. You know what? It really doesn't matter. You live there now, right? You can be mad about it, or you can say, hey, it's not my fault. But if you don't fix the foundation, the whole house is going to collapse. And everyone inside that house is going to suffer. That's where we are with racial and economic inequality. We didn't lay the bricks, but we're standing on them. And if we want a better, fairer society, not just for one group, but for all of us, we've got to be willing to do some repair work to fix the foundation that has cracks in it. Not because we're to blame, but because we know better now. And because we can do better together. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about leveling the field that's always been tilted. Right? We got to level it out. If we have the tools and the data and the power to make that change, the question isn't, why should we? The real question is, why wouldn't we? Right? Why wouldn't we fix it? So now what? We've talked about wages. We've talked about rent. We've talked about price of groceries, the cost of inaction, the weight of a system that's been working against working people going on far too long. And if it feels overwhelming, you're not alone, because it is overwhelming. It's not just one broken policy. It's layer after layer after layer. Wages that haven't kept up, right? They've been kept low. Housing markets that treat shelter like a stock ticker. Healthcare that depends on how much money you have, what kind of care you can receive, right? And a system that tries to punish you for needing help. But here's what I want to say as we wrap this up. It's not hopeless. We're not stuck with this, because these problems didn't just fall from the sky. They were created by policy choice, right? We voted the wrong people into office that have no intention of fixing any of these things. So when people say the economy is broken, what they really mean is that it's working exactly as it was redesigned to work for the ultra wealthy and the billionaires, for the few at the top. But it doesn't have to stay that way. And we've already seen what's possible when we decide to act. We've seen Washington State pass major housing reform. Right? Congress is debating bipartisan legislation that could build over 1 million affordable homes. I sure hope they make the right decision there. We need more homes. And communities are starting to call out systems that got us here and demand better. But change doesn't start in Washington, D.C. Right? It starts with us, right here, right now. It starts with talking about it, refusing to look away. We got to push back on the idea that this is just the way things have to be, because it doesn't. It starts with voting. Pay attention to who you're voting for. It starts with organizing, with showing up at city council meetings, school board hearings, zoning discussions. These are the places where the rules are being written. And maybe most importantly, it starts with empathy, right? With understanding that your neighbor's struggle does not threaten your stability. It's connected to it. That when more people are housed and healthy and paid fairly, we all do better. Everybody does better. Because the real question isn't just why are we broke? It's why we've let it stay this way for so long. And what are we going to do about it next? Right? We need to demand fair wages. So if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right but still falling behind, you're not crazy. You're not lazy. And you're definitely not alone. We're living in a system that needs a serious reset. And the good news is that reset starts with people like you and I, asking those questions, paying attention, and refusing to accept that this is as good as it gets. We got to say, not on our watch, right? There are way more of us than there are of the ultra wealthy. And they only win when we stay divided. So I invite you, let's join together and start fighting the real cause. I want to thank you for listening. I'm Ben Chrisley. I'll see you next time on Evergreen Perspective. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other. Until next time.